next award, please welcome Robert Diggins and Claire Smith.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to a special VOSA Video Presenter Award.
That's right, Claire, and there's been stiff competition for the coveted Golden Sealed Beam Trophy.
But before we find out who the winner is, let's take a look at the nominations.
First, it's Ian Stradling for inspecting the bus.
Let's close the doors first of all. Let's just close the doors first of all.
Might help if you press the green one that says close.
Tell you what, let's use the close button.
Next, we have Tom Callahan for 5 into 7 will go.
Exactly. They've got to be design gross weight greater than 7,500 tonnes. So, no.
And the final nomination is for Henrik Kokaczynski for Don't Miss It.
The things that we've discussed, that's just the way you do it, isn't it?
Yeah, and if anybody does it any way different to that, they're probably wrong.
And the winner is... Tom Callahan.
Yes, it's a very popular choice. Tom Callahan has been appearing in VOSA videos for some years now, and this must be one of the highlights of his career.
Robert. Oh, thanks ever so much.
Very well deserved.
Wow. It's fantastic, yeah. Well, firstly, I'd like to thank... Firstly, I'd like to thank my... Hang on a minute. Can't you get your aim right? Do I have to show you how to check your aim?
Headlamps, Tom.
Dead right, Robert. Come on.
Let's follow.
The most common failure item across all the classes of vehicles is headlamp aim. And today we're not just going to look at cars and bikes and vans, we're going to look at trucks and buses as well.
OK, well, I'll do cars and bikes.
All right, then.
And you, Robert, you're going to wait here for my colleague Jo Thao, because she's going to show you how it's done with heavy goods vehicles and public service vehicles.
All right, then. Yeah, I'll get a drink.
Yeah, I wouldn't go for the tea if I was you.
All right, thanks, Tom.
Tom, is headlamp aim testing something nominated testers have a bit of a problem with sometimes?
Well, what we do know is that it gives us the highest number of incorrect decisions on vehicles that we retest, you know, after they've been recently tested.
Tom, I'm actually quite surprised by that. Why is that?
Well, contrary to what some people believe, we don't naturally assume it's laziness on the part of the tester. We think of other things, you know, do they fully understand the pass-fail criteria? Do they know how to operate their equipment properly? Is the standing area for the vehicle level? Is the equipment faulty? Even are the tyres underinflated? All these are important things to think about.
Now, there are a few different types of pieces of equipment that you can use for this. How should you go about using them?
Well, there are many different models, but there's only 3 basic principles, really. Say for class 1 and 2 motorcycle testing, they can have what's known as an aiming screen. And this can be wall-mounted, or it can be floor-mounted on rails, so you can move it side to side. Then there's there's 2 types, really, depending on the focal length. And there's what's known as a collector lens, which is probably the most common type. And these are for all classes of vehicles, and these are totally rail-mounted. And then thirdly, there's what some people call the reflective lens, which is known as a Lucas Hartridge Mark III. That's for all classes of vehicle, that's totally rail-mounted. And we're actually going to look at a piece of equipment like that later on.
Now, is there any special secret in using any of these pieces of equipment?
Well, there's no secrets. I mean, it's really a matter of the tester making sure that they read the operating instructions and they know how to operate the equipment. But if they don't align the equipment up properly, then really the whole headlamp aim test is a waste of time. The aligning of the equipment is crucial.
How do you go about making sure that's correct?
Well, there's 3 elements to this. The first one is the distance between the headlamp aim tester and the lamp. This has to be set up in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions so that we can get the clearest image. Now, there are some vehicles that have what are known as complex headlamps, And it may be the tester would have to ignore the manufacturer's instructions and get the lamp as close to the aim tester as possible.
What happens if you can't get close enough because of the way the test equipment is actually set out?
What you mean, like if you had a hoist with stops at the end
Yeah.
of it? Yeah. Well, if it had a complex headlamp and the tester couldn't get it close enough to get this clear image, then they would have to refuse to test.
So what's next then, Tom?
Right, now we have to set what's known as the longitudinal axis. That's getting the headlamp aim tester at right angles to that axis. Because what we're measuring there is the direction of the headlamp aim. Is it to the right, to the left, to the centre? So we're setting the equipment up in parallel to the centre line of the vehicle.
So if the alignment's not right, how do you go about setting it then?
Well, you can align that because the manufacturers allow different ways of rotating the headlamp aim tester. The one that's different is that Lucas Hartridge Mark III.
Now, you did mention before 3 elements.
The third element's kind of in 2 parts, really, and simply all we're doing there is aligning the headlamp aim tester to the correct height of the headlamp and getting it to the centre point of the headlamp. And this is the part that testers have to reset for each headlamp that they check.
Once you've done your alignment, presumably now we check the aim, do we? Which headlamp do you start with?
We check all obligatory headlamps, plus any additional dip beam lamps.
So now we're going to switch on, do we?
Well, it's not quite as straightforward as that. Now we have to think about the different types of headlamp, because there's 3 different types of headlamp.
So it's another lot of 3s again then, Tom. What are the 3 different types of headlamps you're looking for?
The most common one is the European E-marked headlamp, and these are in any shape. And then there's 2 British American types, and both these types, the headlamp is round in shape.
So how can you tell which type of headlamp is fitted then?
Well, the European E-marked one has approval marks on it. It has either a capital E or a small e with a number. And then the British American types have either a figure 1 or a figure 2 marked on the headlamp.
So what are you actually looking for on the piece of test equipment?
On the headlamp aim tester, there's a backing screen. And on that screen, there are 2 0 lines. There's a vertical 0 line and there's a horizontal 0 line. And we measure the aim image against these. Remember, what we're looking to check is the headlamp too high, too low, too far to the right, too far to the left.
Now, how do you actually assess the information that comes through on this piece of equipment?
Well, if we're dealing with the European E-marked headlamp, which is checked on dipped beam, that has an image shape. And the image shape gives us a horizontal line, and then it has what's known as a break point, at which point the image kicks up at an angle of around about 15 degrees. Yeah? So we can measure the height against the horizontal, and we can measure the direction against the break point. On the British American, there's one type that's measured on main beam. And what we do with this headlamp is we make the assessment by putting it on main beam and then looking at the centre point of a hot spot. So in the middle of the image is a bright hot spot.
Now, what about the other type of British American headlamp?
The second British American type, what we assess on dipped beam, and it's pretty well a pretty rare headlamp. And the information about these, obviously, all these lamps and assessments are in the inspection manual.
Tom, where should those parts of the images be on the headlamp testers? Should we start with the European types first?
Yes. On the European headlamp, which we check on dip beam, if the headlamp's centre point is not more than 850mm above the ground, then the horizontal part of the image mustn't be above the 0.5% line, mustn't be below the 2% line. In other words, it mustn't be outside the red parameters.
What if it does happen to be above 850mm?
If it's above 850mm, then that horizontal part of the beam image mustn't be above the 1.25% line, mustn't be below the 2.75% line. So in other words, it mustn't be outside the blue parameters.
So what about the direction?
Right, for the direction, the break point that I mentioned earlier, that mustn't be to the right of the 0% vertical line, and it mustn't be to the left of the 2% vertical line. Now, there's one final thing. The kick up from this break point must be to the near side.
Now, what about the British American type?
The British American type that has the number 1 figure on it, these are checked on main beam. And we're assessing against the centre of the hotspot. Now, the centre of the hotspot mustn't be above the 0% horizontal line for vehicles with the headlamp aim that is not more than 850mm from the ground, and it mustn't be below the 2% horizontal line, in other words, the lower red parameter. For vehicles that have got headlamps above the 850mm, then the central hotspot mustn't be above the 0% horizontal line once again, and they mustn't be below the 2 3/4% bottom, you know, the bottom blue line.
And direction?
The direction, the centre of the hotspot mustn't be to the right of the 0% vertical line or to the left of the 2% vertical line.
So if they are outside those limits, presumably the vehicle will fail?
They fail.
OK. Tom, what if the headlamps fitted can't be identified as one of the 3 types that we have talked about?
Well, 2 considerations here, really. If they're pre-1950, then the information referring to these is in the inspection manual. And there are some headlamps that don't have a brake point and a kick-up. They just have a horizontal line. So we treat these as if they, for the European criteria, and we just measure the height.
So, Tom, now I put the lights on.
No, you just need to wait a minute, because the first element that we talked about on the alignment was making sure the distance between the headlamp aim tester and the lamp. And this one's great, because on here it just says it needs to be between 100mm and 300mm. Yeah? So this one's, the distance is good. Yeah,
cool.
That's fine. And then we have to set up that longitudinal axis. Is this parallel with the centre line of the vehicle? And on this particular one, so if I just move it over to there. Yeah.
Right.
Now, what we've got on this one is we've got this little device here, because you can rotate this. See?
OK.
Yeah. And so we've got these 2 parallel lines, and we look for 2 points on the vehicle. Could be the top edge of the windscreen, on a lot of vehicles could be the front of the bonnet. This has got, fortunately, the 2 windscreen washer jets are absolutely level and nicely shaped, and we've got a little mirror here to help me line that up. So I just look for 2 points.
Oh, I see. You line them up with the 2 points on the bonnet.
Yeah, that's it. And I've got them perfectly in between the 2 parallel lines. So I know that this is in parallel to the centre line of the vehicle.
Cool. Now
and
what?
the beam setter is at right angles. Now we move it across, and there's that third element, making sure that it's central with the centre of the headlamp, and that it's at the right height. This has a meter on it, so we can measure the strength of the headlamp beam. So if we switch the headlamps on, and now we can just raise and lower it, and you can see that? Mm-hmm. And that would be now central to the headlamp. And it shows us the horizontal line, which parameters it's in, and the brake point. Can you see that?
Mm.
Hi Rob, I'm Jo.
Great to see you, Jo.
Hiya, and I'm going to show you headlamp aim testing on heavy goods vehicles and public service vehicles.
OK, lead the way.
Okay.
Jo, is there a big difference between testing the aim of headlamps on small vehicles and those on trucks and buses?
Not really. The types of headlamp are the same, the European and the British American, but there are a few extras to remember because of the greater size of the vehicles involved.
And what are the test criteria?
The criteria are the same. Of course, you're more likely to find headlamps with the centres more than 850mm from the ground than you are on the smaller vehicles. And of course, it's easier to align the test equipment to the vehicle because trucks and buses have got flat sides that you can use.
Now, I know about these red and blue lines, but there are some broken red and broken blue lines. What are they for?
Trucks tend to carry heavier loads than cars, and these loads can result in a greater rear suspension deflection. In other words, the rear of the vehicle tends to go lower than with a car. If a truck has a short wheelbase and carries a greater load, it can make quite a difference to the aim in the headlamp. At its highest aim, the lights mustn't dazzle, but we allow for a greater range of downward movement.
So how do we allow for this movement?
The limits are the same as everything else, except in the case of a 2 or 3 axle tractor unit or a 2 or 3 axle rigid vehicle with a wheelbase of 5 metres or less. In either case, not fitted with self-levelling rear suspension, self-levelling headlamps and a driver's headlamp aim adjustment control where the lower limit is different.
Where's the wheelbase measured from?
The wheelbase is measured from wheel centre to wheel centre, or from the centre of a single wheel to the centre of the bogie.
So what happens with these vehicles then?
The lower limit changes to 3.25% or 4%, depending on the height of the headlamp from the ground.
So for these vehicles, the ranges are either between the upper red line and the lower broken red line, or between the upper blue line and the lower broken blue line.
Yes, that's right, Robert.
Is this difference the same with PSVs?
No, it's only heavy goods vehicles. Public service vehicles use the same criteria as cars.
Remember that for a small fee, HGV and PSV operators can take their vehicles to their local VOSA GVTS for a multi-check, which includes headlamp aim.
Remember I talked about the Lucas Hartridge Mark III? Mm-hmm. Well, we've come to this test station because they have that type of equipment.
Now, take it, Tom, that the pass and fail criteria is the same, but it's just tested slightly differently.
Yeah, it's important to remember that the criteria is the same for all machines. But this machine, as you say, is used slightly differently, and this is going to give us the opportunity to see how it operates. Well, this one, people refer to this as a reflector lens, but the idea is that to get this lined up with the car in the longitudinal axis that we talked about earlier. And to start with, the first thing we have to do is look at the car and decide which side of the car is nearest, is furthest forward. And you can see clearly on this one, it's the offside one. So we'll just move the equipment over to this side. On the side of this equipment is this simple little gauge, a measuring gauge, and you can see quite clearly that it's got markings on it. You see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now this is actually measured on the top sliding gauge, and this is a pointer. So when we place these onto the equipment, we have one for the offside and one for the near side. Okay. We mustn't change that.
Right.
We just place it simply underneath the equipment like that and fit it on there. Now we need to decide 2 points on the vehicle that are identical. Normally the edge of the headlamp, but it could be the bodywork. We'll go for the edge of the headlamp.
Okay.
And we'll set the offside slider to the offside headlamp at a point. We'll just demonstrate this. We just bring it across like this and just raise it up, simply like that. I'll just move that forward. Just put it on that point there. It's ideal if you don't ever have to take this off to move it across. And on such a vehicle like this you can, because the headlights slope away. But if you do take it off, you must be very careful to fit it, if you have to take it off, fit it back in exactly the same position. But for this vehicle, I just raise that up in the air like that, and I come across the other headlamp.
Okay. How common are these pieces of equipment? And most garages have them?
There's a lot of garages have them, because they've been around for quite a long time. And,
right.
And each garage that has one thinks they're the only one that's got it, but there's a lot of these about.
Oh, right.
So if I then just drop this down, and now we're on the near side, we use the left-hand slider gauge. We bring that out and we touch this headlamp at the same point. Now we can just, for the moment, raise that up, holding it firmly. Now we've got actually a set measurement. Can you see that there? And that's saying to us that there's a 4% angle on the vehicle.
Oh, right.
Yeah. You don't even need to understand what all of that means. You just need to know that that's how it is. But,
yeah.
And if we just place that onto there like that, we know what that measurement is. It's 4%. And what I'll do is I'll just reset a 0 line here on the equipment. And this is telling me that I need to go
4%
to the offside.
Yeah.
So let's just release this and take that round to the 4. Tighten it up, and that's now my 0 line.
Ah, right. Okay.
Simple as that. So that's the angle, the longitudinal axis set up to this equipment now.
Okay, so what's next?
And I'll just pop that back on there, and now we need to set up for the height. So we might as well start the offside, or we'll start the offside.
Okay.
And just bring this lamp down, this equipment down, and just line it up with the centre of the headlight. It's not absolutely crucial on this type of equipment, but you know, we can get it as near as we can to the centre, height-wise, of the headlight. Remember we talked earlier about height? So we've done longitudinal axis, now we've set up the height, and now we need to centralise it to the headlamp itself, you know, because the width of the headlight. So we just bring it across here, and I need to now just look through the centre of here and make a judgment.
That's quite easy to do, isn't it?
Yeah. So now all we need to do is put the headlight on. You can now see that the image from the headlamp is reflected onto this front screen.
Yeah.
And on the front screen, we've got a vertical black line and we've got a horizontal black line. So we can measure the direction and the height. So if I just take this little turn knob here, and as I twist it, you can see that can you see that brake point there?
It's moving, yeah,
moving across. So if I line that up centrally to this vertical line, and now for the height, you can see I can raise and lower by operating this turn knob on this little dial gauge. So if I bring it down, the horizontal just touches onto the black horizontal line, and now I'm in a position to read off from the gauges whether the headlight position is set. And you can see, in terms of direction, I'm between the 0 and 2%, so that's okay.
Yeah.
And in terms of the height, even though this image on here is faded a little, you can still read it, and it's in the red parameter, and we're nicely in the red band because these headlamps are not more than 850mm. This headlamp's okay. And all we do now is we just move it across the other side, set the height up and central to the headlamp, repeat the whole process.
Joe, I've sometimes seen tape on headlamps. What's that for?
Right-hand dipped headlamps that are used on the continent can be temporarily altered for use in the United Kingdom by fitting either a mask or a converter kit. These are usually stickers that are attached to the headlamp lens, and it'll remove the beam kick up to the right. The image will be shown as a horizontal solid line, and the tester need only check the height of the aim. He also must check that the kit is secure and that the light output is not unduly reduced.
So what if the vehicle has a driver's headlamp aim adjustment control?
The only time a tester needs to touch this control is when the headlamp aim is too low, and then he's expected to check their aim again with the adjustment control set in its highest position. But they must make sure that they check all testable headlamps on the same setting.
So what you've just told me applies to all vehicles then?
Absolutely, Robert.
So, Tom, now for a subject close to my heart. Bikes, talk us through how you're going to be testing headlamp aim on heat.
Yeah. Well, when you're testing headlamps on motorcycles, all the different makes of headlamp testing equipment we've talked about, they can use in motorcycle testing. But there's also an additional type of equipment that they can use that can't be used in any other classes. And that's it.
Screen.
It's the screen, yeah.
Tell me exactly what you're going to do to test this bike then.
If we look at the bay first of all and look at the equipment, and if you look at the screen, you can see that it's set in rails, so you can move it side to side.
Yeah.
And you can also raise and lower the screen.
You need to with some of the modern bikes now. All the headlights are different heights.
Exactly.
So, Tom, you've lined the bike up centrally. What's that line there for?
Right, we have a line going across the bay, and that line is set distance from the screen. This is the larger screen, so the distance is 3.81 metres. And we align the headlamp distance from the screen by using that line.
OK. Right, well, lights are over that side. I'll let you walk over there.
Well, you
Shall I line it up for you properly?
You straighten it up for me.
Right.
Yeah. Now we're satisfied with that, we need to set the screen to the height of the headlamp. And so we've got this lovely piece of equipment here.
Modern technology.
Modern
right,
technology. And they make a judgment on which is the centre of the headlamp, the height of the headlamp.
Is that quite difficult to find on these modern bikes?
It can be quite difficult, but with practice, testers get used to it. And this one we're lining up to, we can actually see the headlamp on. We line it up to that as a centre. So now we've set that to the height of the headlamp, and all we simply do is the horizontal black dotted line on the screen will be aligned to the top edge of this. Just line that up there. Yep, spot on. And now you just simply switch on the headlights. And now you can see quite clearly, this is European E-beam. So we've got the horizontal line, and then we've got the brake point.
Now, does it matter about the height of the headlamp?
Yes, it does. And I know that this one is not more than 850mm in height. and so therefore we use the red parameters, because the little device I use to set the height of the screen, you can clearly see is marked in red and blue, and it's definitely in the red, so this is okay.
Okay, I'll flex that up. There we go.
Are there any tips to help ensure that an accurate test is carried out, Joe?
You must ensure that the vehicle is level and in the position that it runs on the road. So if you check any vehicle after jacking it up and lowering it, you should roll the vehicle forwards and backwards enough to allow the vehicle to settle on its suspension. This is normally only a problem if the headlamp aim testing equipment is directly in front of the pit or hoist.
OK, that makes sense. Any other helpful tips?
It's a good idea for someone who's prepared a vehicle to test to make sure that the tyre pressures are correct.
Okay.
Now, Tom, presumably the equipment needs properly looking after and checking, doesn't it?
Yes, it need to check that the standing area remains as level as it was when the VTS was first certified.
OK, that's the standing area. What about the headlamp tester itself?
Right, it's very important to check that the wheels are clean and secure and not damaged, because just a little bit of misalignment can affect the test results.
What about the rails that's running along here?
And the rails too, checking that they're clean and they're secure and they're not damaged, because keeping the headlamp tester and the rails in good condition will ensure consistency of test results.
Now, there are lots of different models, aren't there, and presumably lots of different ways to calibrate them as well.
In the operating instructions, the manufacturers explain the different ways to calibrate. Calibration needs to be carried out at least every 6 months so that we can check that the equipment is aligned and recorded as being aligned.
Can calibration and checking the headlamp tester take place in the same place?
That's the minimum requirement, but it's a good idea to do it at different points along the rails, and then it gives a good indication that the rails are level.
Now, you've given us lots of ideas there above the minimum, and calibration's not difficult, so it's probably a good idea to do it more often than 6 months.
Yeah, do more than the minimum seldom does any harm and often does a lot of good.
What about other issues about lighting?
Well, other issues are covered in another potential award-winning video, Claire, and that video is called Lighten Up. Firstly, I'd like to thank, wow, so many people. The whole of the film crew, the producer, the director, Bosa for giving me the opportunity, my co-presenters, there's Claire and Robert, Sylvia for my wardrobe, my neighbour who knows about it. In this case, 3.81 metres from the screen, because that's the largest screen.
There are 2 lines there, actually. How do you know which one to put on?
Don't mention the second line, because we won't work that one out.
Ah.